Dawn broke across the Texas prairie, morning light streaming through the weathered wooden gate of a sprawling ranch. A thin young woman stepped down from an old bus, clutching a worn suitcase to her chest, exhaustion and desperation written across her face. She approached the substantial wooden ranch house, her eyes filled with equal parts hope and fear. A tall man in a work shirt and cowboy hat stood near the horse corral, checking on his animals, his face shadowed by the wide brim. She trembled as she spoke. "Please, just give me any job. Anything at all." He looked up, his eyes deep and measuring, and replied, "Can you stay?" Isabella Torres was 27 years old and had learned that desperation changes the shape of your dreams. What had once been hopes for a career, for stability, for a normal life had shrunk down to a single prayer. "Please let me feed my son today." She was a single mother to 6-year-old Mateo, a bright boy with curious eyes who deserved so much more than the chaos Isabella had barely managed to provide. She'd fled the city after losing her job, with debts piling up and an abusive ex-husband's threats echoing in her memory. The only thing of value she still possessed was a small necklace with the word hope engraved on it, the last gift from her mother before she passed away. Isabella clutched it whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her, which was often. They'd been sleeping on a friend's couch, but that arrangement had ended yesterday. With nowhere left to turn in the city, Isabella had used her last bit of money for bus tickets to the rural areas, hoping that farms and ranches might need workers who'd accept low pay and ask few questions. Richard Calloway was 45 years old and had spent the last decade building walls around himself as carefully as he'd built his successful ranch. After his wife died in a riding accident, he'd thrown himself into work, expanding his property to thousands of acres, becoming wealthy and respected. People in town called him the rich loner, a man who provided jobs and paid fairly, but kept himself at a distance, communicating in brief sentences and avoiding any social gatherings. His only companions were his horses, his ranch hands, and memories he tried unsuccessfully to outrun. He still kept his late wife's saddle in the barn, cleaning and polishing it every week, as if she might return to use it. It was the only piece of the past he allowed himself to tend. That morning, Richard was checking the new foals when he noticed figures at the ranch gate. A woman and a small boy, both looking lost and desperate. He'd seen this before. People seeking work during hard times, but something about the way the woman held the child close made him pause. Isabella approached slowly, Mateo's hand gripped tightly in hers. Up close, Richard could see that her clothes were clean but worn thin, her face showing the particular exhaustion that comes from months of stress, not just a bad night's sleep. "Sir," Isabella said, her voice barely steady, "I can cook, clean, tend gardens, whatever you need. I'll work hard for very little. My son and I need somewhere to be." She didn't say somewhere to live or somewhere to work. She said somewhere to be, and the honesty of it struck Richard somewhere deep. He studied her face, saw the pride she was swallowing to ask this, saw the fierce protectiveness in how she positioned herself between him and her son. He saw himself years ago, newly orphaned, begging for work at a different ranch. "Can you stay as family?" The words came out before he'd fully thought them through, but once spoken, he didn't take them back. Isabella stared at him, confusion mixing with disbelief. I don't understand. I have ranch hands, workers, employees," Richard said quietly. "What I don't have is family. If you're looking for just a job, I can offer that. But if you're looking for somewhere to belong, that's a different question." Isabella felt tears threatening. After years of hearing temporary, arrangement, accommodation, someone had used the word family. "Yes," she whispered, "we can stay." Isabella's first days on the ranch were a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and crushing inadequacy. She knew nothing about ranch life, had never cooked for groups of working men, had never dealt with horses or livestock, but she tried with every ounce of strength she had. Richard had given them a small guest house on the property, nothing fancy, but it had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and most importantly, it was theirs. Mateo had his own room for the first time in his young life, and he'd stared at the space in wonder, as if afraid it might disappear. Isabella learned quickly, driven by determination not to lose this chance. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, studied online recipes during Mateo's afternoon rest time, and stayed up late cleaning and organizing. Her hands, already worn from years of hard work, developed new calluses. Richard watched her struggle and adapt, remembering his own journey from desperate teenager to ranch owner. He didn't offer excessive help. He sensed she needed to earn her place, to prove to herself she deserved to be there. But he was patient when she made mistakes, showed her efficient ways to do tasks, and quietly left instructional books where she'd find them. Mateo thrived immediately. The ranch became his kingdom of discovery. He followed the border collies around, learned the names of every horse, and spent hours watching the ranch hands work. Richard found himself teaching the boy small tasks: how to approach a horse, how to hold a rope properly, how to read the sky for weather. One evening, after Mateo was asleep, Isabella and Richard found themselves on the ranch house porch, sharing the quiet after a long day. The Texas sky was enormous above them, stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. "Thank you," Isabella said quietly, "for this chance, for not asking too many questions about where we came from." Richard was silent for a moment, then spoke in the careful way of someone unused to sharing. "My wife, Caroline, died 10 years ago. Riding accident. One moment she was laughing, next moment, gone." Isabella didn't offer platitudes. She just listened. "After that, I kept working. Bought more land, hired more people, built this whole operation. But I was building walls, not a life. This ranch got bigger and bigger, and I got smaller and smaller inside it." "I understand," Isabella replied. "My ex-husband, Mateo's father, was violent. When I finally got the courage to leave, I thought freedom would feel lighter. But it just felt empty, like I'd escaped one kind of prison for another." They sat in companionable silence. Two people who'd learned that survival sometimes meant shutting down the parts of yourself that could still hope. Over the following weeks, small moments of connection accumulated. Richard taught Mateo to ride a gentle mare, his large hands steadying the boy's small ones on the reins. Isabella mended a rip in Richard's work shirt and noticed his hands were as calloused as hers. Different work, same dedication. The evening meals became communal affairs. Isabella insisted that Richard eat with her and Mateo rather than alone in the main house, as he'd done for years. The ranch hands often joined them in the big kitchen, and the space filled with conversation and laughter in a way it hadn't in a decade. Isabella noticed she'd started unconsciously including Richard in small domestic rituals. She'd set out 3 coffee cups in the morning instead of 2. She'd ask Mateo to draw pictures for the 3 of us. She'd think in terms of we when planning meals or activities. Richard found himself changing his patterns too. He'd avoided his late wife's favorite spots on the ranch for years, but now he showed them to Isabella and Mateo. The hill where Caroline had loved to watch sunsets. The grove of trees where they'd planned to build a tree house for children they never had. One afternoon, as they worked together in the vegetable garden Isabella had started, Richard pulled out the necklace he'd worn hidden under his shirt for 10 years, his wedding band on a chain. He looked at it for a long moment, then carefully placed it in his pocket rather than back around his neck. "You don't have to stop loving her," Isabella said gently. "I'm not stopping," Richard replied. "I'm just making room for something else too." That evening, Mateo fell asleep on the porch swing between them, his small body warm and trusting. Richard carried him to bed, tucking him in with a tenderness that suggested he'd practiced this in dreams for years. When he returned to the porch, Isabella was holding her hope necklace, looking out at the ranch. "I wore this every day as a reminder that I had to keep hoping," she said, "but I think I've been confusing hope with desperation. Real hope isn't just wishing for rescue. It's believing you can build something worth keeping." Richard sat beside her. "I think you're right. And I think maybe what we're building here is worth keeping." The next morning, Isabella woke to find Richard already in the kitchen, attempting to make breakfast. His pancakes were misshapen. The coffee was too strong, but the gesture of trying to care for them in return made Isabella's throat tight with emotion. She realized she'd unconsciously prepared 3 coffee cups again, but this time she noticed, and she smiled. The peace they'd built was shattered when Charlotte Calloway arrived unannounced in her luxury SUV. Richard's younger sister was everything he wasn't: polished, urban, ambitious, and utterly convinced of her own superior judgment. "Richard, we need to talk about your situation," Charlotte said, barely glancing at Isabella as she strode into the ranch house as if she owned it. Charlotte was a successful businesswoman in Dallas, and she'd heard through family channels about Richard's charity case living on the ranch. She'd driven out immediately, armed with opinions and intentions. "Isabella is working here," Richard said carefully. "She's been a tremendous help." "A tremendous help?" Charlotte laughed coldly. "Richard, she's a nobody with a child, no qualifications, and clearly she's taking advantage of your isolation. I've already contacted a professional ranch management service. They can send someone qualified." Isabella, who'd been clearing lunch dishes, froze. Mateo, playing with toy horses nearby, looked up with worried eyes. "That won't be necessary," Richard said, his voice hardening. But Charlotte was just getting started. She'd arranged a family gathering, calling in cousins, family friends, and business associates under the guise of a ranch celebration. In reality, it was a stage for her to demonstrate why Isabella didn't belong. At the gathering that evening, with dozens of well-dressed guests milling about the ranch house, Charlotte made her move. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced, her voice carrying across the room. "To my brother Richard, who's always had such a kind heart, sometimes too kind. Some people might take advantage of that kindness, might see a wealthy rancher and think they've found a meal ticket." She looked directly at Isabella as she spoke. "Tell me, Miss Torres, did you plan this? Show up desperate, play on my brother's loneliness, use your child as sympathy bait? Did you think you could transform from penniless drifter to ranch wife?" The room fell silent. Isabella felt every eye on her, felt the judgment and curiosity. Her face burned with humiliation, and she wanted to run, to grab Mateo and disappear into the Texas night. But Mateo stood up, his small voice clear in the awful silence. "Don't be mean to my mama. She works harder than anybody." Richard had been across the room, but he moved quickly to stand beside Isabella and Mateo. He removed his cowboy hat, a gesture that in ranch country signals serious business, and placed it deliberately on the table. "Charlotte, you're my sister, so I'm going to say this with as much respect as I can manage," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to running a large operation. "You don't understand the first thing about what I need." He turned to face the gathered crowd. "For 10 years, I've run this ranch alone. I've been successful by every measure except the one that matters. I've had no one to share breakfast with, no one to laugh with at the end of a long day, no one to remind me that a house is different from a home." He looked at Isabella, and his voice softened. "This woman arrived with nothing but courage and her son. She didn't ask for charity. She asked for a chance to work, to contribute, to be part of something. And in doing that, she gave me back something I thought was gone forever. A reason to come home." The crowd murmured, some disapproving, some clearly moved. Charlotte wasn't finished. "Richard, think about what you're saying. Think about the business implications, the family reputation." "I am thinking," Richard interrupted, "I'm thinking that reputation built on coldness isn't worth having. I'm thinking that success without family is just isolation with better furniture." Then as the entire room watched in shock, Richard knelt before Isabella. From his shirt pocket, he pulled out a simple gold ring. Not his late wife's, but one he'd bought in town that afternoon, a decision he'd made before Charlotte had ever arrived. "Isabella Torres," he said, his voice steady despite the momentous nature of what he was doing. "I can't promise this will be easy. Being with me means dealing with people like my sister, means navigating a world that will judge you. But I can promise that you and Mateo will never have to wander again. I can promise a home, not just a house. I can promise that every day you'll know you belong." He paused, looking up at her with complete vulnerability. "Will you marry me? Will you let me be the family you've been looking for?" Isabella stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. Mateo gripped her hand tightly, his eyes wide with hope. The crowd held its collective breath. "I don't need you to rescue me," Isabella said, her voice shaking but clear. "I need you to see me as an equal, to understand that I bring value too, not money or connections, but heart and work and dedication to building something real." I do see that, Richard replied. That's exactly why I'm asking. Not because I feel sorry for you, but because my life is better with you in it. Isabella looked at Mateo, who nodded eagerly. She looked at the necklace around her neck. Hope! And realized that hope had finally taken solid form. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes. Richard stood and slipped the ring onto her finger. The room erupted in mixed reactions, some applauding, others murmuring disapproval, Charlotte looking utterly defeated. An elderly ranch hand named Jose stepped forward, his weathered face split with a grin. Boss has been half alive for 10 years. Good to see him whole again. Charlotte gathered her things and left without another word, unable to accept what she saw as her brother's terrible mistake. But Richard barely noticed her departure. He was too busy holding Isabella and Mateo, finally understanding what home really meant. If you believe true love can grow from desperate circumstances, drop a heart below to help this story fly. The weeks following the proposal brought unexpected challenges and equally unexpected joys. Local newspapers picked up the story, Wealthy Rancher Proposes to Homeless Woman, and public opinion split sharply between those who saw it as romantic and those who viewed it as foolish. But Isabella discovered something surprising. She didn't care as much as she thought she would. The judgment that would have destroyed her confidence months ago now seemed less important than the life she was actively building. She enrolled in ranch management courses at the local community college, determined to be a true partner in the operation. Not just Richard's wife, she studied accounting, livestock management, and sustainable agriculture with the same fierce determination she'd brought to simply surviving. Richard watched her transformation with quiet pride. The timid woman who'd arrived begging for work was becoming someone confident in her own capabilities. He'd offer help when she asked, but mostly he stepped back and let her find her own way. I spent so long being ashamed of needing help, Isabella told him one evening as they reviewed financial records together. I thought accepting assistance meant I was weak, but there's a difference between dependence and partnership. What's the difference? Richard asked, though he thought he knew. Dependence means you can't function without someone. Partnership means you function better together than apart. We're building something neither of us could build alone. The ranch itself began to change under Isabella's influence. She suggested converting one of the unused barns into a community center where ranch hands' families could gather. She organized a ranch-to-table program, selling organic produce to local restaurants. She didn't try to replace what had been there. She added to it, enhanced it, made it more than it had been. Richard found himself changing too. He laughed more, spoke more, engaged with his employees as people rather than just workers. He'd been so focused on building a business that he'd forgotten about building a life. Together, they established a new ritual. Every Sunday, they would plant something new on the ranch. Flowers, trees, vegetables. Mateo would help dig holes and pat soil with his small hands, delighting in being included in grown-up work. Why do we keep planting stuff? Mateo asked one afternoon as they put in a row of sunflowers near the main gate. Because, Richard explained, kneeling beside the boy, we want anyone who comes here to see light. We want them to know this is a place where things grow. Isabella added, and because every time we plant something, we're promising to be here to see it bloom. We're choosing this place, this life, over and over. Richard had one final piece of healing to complete. He led Isabella to the barn where he'd kept Caroline's saddle for 10 years, maintained but unused. This was Caroline's, he said quietly. I kept it as a shrine, I think. A way to keep the past alive. But I've realized that's not what she would have wanted. He ran his hand over the worn leather. She would have wanted me to ride again, to live again. And I think she would have liked you. You both had this quality of seeing what could be instead of what was. Together, they decided to donate the saddle to a therapeutic riding program for children with disabilities, letting it serve others rather than sitting as a monument to loss. One evening, as they worked on the sunflower garden, Mateo asked the question that had been building, Richard, are you going to be my dad? Richard set down his shovel and pulled Mateo into a hug. If you want me to be, then yes. From now on, I'm your dad. I want you to be, Mateo said, his small arms wrapped tight around Richard's neck. Can I call you Dad? I would be honored, Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. Isabella watched this exchange with tears in her eyes. All those months of struggle, of desperation, of wondering if they would survive, they'd led here to this moment of a small boy finally having the father he deserved. That night they sat together on the porch, their porch now, and looked out at their ranch, their home, their life. "Do you remember what you asked me that first day?" Isabella said. "You asked if I could stay as family." "I remember," Richard replied. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant. Family isn't just living in the same place or sharing meals. It's choosing each other every day, even when it's hard." Richard took her hand, the simple gold ring catching the moonlight. "Especially when it's hard." Mateo had fallen asleep on the porch swing between them, peaceful and secure. The sunflowers they'd planted were already starting to sprout, small green shoots promising future blooms. The ranch hands had gone home to their own families, the horses were settled in their stalls, and the vast Texas sky stretched endlessly above them. They had built this, not through grand gestures or perfect planning, but through daily choices to stay, to work, to grow together. If you believe a family can be planted and grown from the ground up, hit like to spread seeds of hope. 6 months after that first desperate morning when Isabella had arrived at the ranch, everything was different and yet fundamentally simple. She was no longer a visitor or an employee. She was home. The small guest house had been converted into an art studio for Mateo, and Isabella and Richard shared the main ranch house. Every room reflected their combined life. Ranch business papers mixed with Mateo's artwork, Richard's old cowboy boots beside Isabella's work shoes, 3 coffee cups permanently stationed by the coffee maker. On the refrigerator, held by horseshoe magnets, hung Mateo's latest drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands, labeled in careful child's handwriting, Mom, me, and Dad Richard. That morning, as dawn broke across the prairie once again, Isabella stood on the porch where she'd first approached Richard. The difference between that desperate woman and who she was now felt almost impossibly vast, yet completely natural. Richard joined her, carrying 2 coffee cups. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "You know," Isabella said softly, "I came here begging for any job, any scrap of security. I was so desperate I would have accepted anything." "I know," Richard replied, "but you didn't offer me just anything. You offered me family, and at the time I didn't understand what you meant. I thought you were just being kind or maybe a little crazy." She turned to face him fully. "Now I understand. You weren't offering me a place to work or even a place to live. You were offering me a place to belong, the chance to build something together instead of just surviving alone." Richard set down his coffee cup and took both her hands in his. "I asked if you could stay as family because I was tired of being alone in a crowd. I needed family more than I needed an employee. You gave me that. You and Mateo gave me a reason to make this house a home again." "We're still building it," Isabella said, "still figuring out how to be a family." "That's what families do," Richard replied. "They build themselves day by day, choice by choice." At that moment, Mateo came running out of the house, already dressed in his miniature cowboy hat and boots, ready for the morning feeding routine he now helped with. "Dad! Mom! Can we check if the sunflowers bloomed yet?" he called out. Together, the 3 of them walked down to the main gate where they'd planted the sunflowers months ago. The flowers had grown tall, their bright yellow faces turning toward the morning sun, creating a welcoming path to the ranch. "They bloomed," Mateo whispered in awe, as if witnessing a miracle. "They did," Isabella agreed, kneeling beside him, "because we took care of them, because we were here every day, making sure they had what they needed to grow." Richard joined them, his hand on Isabella's shoulder, his other hand ruffling Mateo's hair. "That's what we do for each other too. We stay, we care, we grow together." They stood there for a moment, 3 people who'd found each other in desperation and built something beautiful through daily choice. The ranch stretched out around them, thousands of acres of land, but more importantly, acres of possibility, of future, of family. Later, as Isabella prepared breakfast and Mateo set the table for 3, and Richard checked on the morning ranch operations, she realized that the necklace she wore, Hope, had taken on a new meaning. Hope wasn't just wishing for rescue anymore. Hope was planting sunflowers and believing they'd bloom. Hope was 3 coffee cups set out each morning. Hope was a small boy calling someone dad and meaning it. Hope was choosing every single day to stay and build and grow. Isabella touched the ring on her finger and smiled. They had finally arrived home. Family isn't where you're born, but where you're chosen and where you choose to build, day by day together. If you want more stories where kindness and love mend broken places, hit subscribe. The next story might touch your heart. Subscribe for more powerful stories of finding family and home. Hit that bell.